Tewkesbury is at the heart of leafy, southern, educated, middle-class Britain. And in so many ways, it is normal English towns like this that hold the key to why Britain voted to leave the EU. In June, it voted 53% to leave. Tewkesbury is normal Middle England. In almost all of England, there was a narrow majority to leave. What people don't know is that 59% of all Leave voters were middle class. Of those, 34% of all Leave voters were social class A and B, managers and professionals. Only 17% of all Leave voters were skilled manual workers, white van man if you like. The vote to leave Europe was largely a middle class English vote. Professionals were the only social class group to vote majority Remain, 57% across the UK. But they were such a large group of voters and turnout amongst them was so high that they also constituted the largest block of Leave voters. The Brexit vote has been unfairly blamed on the poor. Geographers divide the UK, north and south, with a line that runs all the way from the Wash right down to the Severn. Below that line lives 52% of all Leave voters. There are a few places in the south, such as London and Oxford and Cheltenham, where house prices are high and rents are high, and you have to be doing well to be able to live there. And in those places, a majority voted Remain. But across the rest of the south of England, a narrow majority of people voted to leave in almost every place. And it's not just the middle classes who voted for Brexit. A common myth has sprung up that it was the lower classes, especially Northern English voters, that swung the pendulum in favour of Brexit. That they mattered this much is fantasy. There's a caricature of elderly voters, an affluent generation of pensioners voting out the hopes of the young. But in fact, since 2012, the life expectancy of elderly women began to fall in Britain. It got worse in 2013, and in 2015 we had one of the largest rises in mortality that we've had since the Second World War. Our health is getting worse. If we wanted a health service funded at the levels they have in Germany, we would actually have to spend an extra £1 billion every week on the NHS. The old have not been doing well in the UK in recent years. It is hardly surprising then that older voters, more dependent on health and care services, found the £350 million figure so alluring. Economically, in the 1970s, the UK was one of the most equal large countries in Europe before it entered what is now the EU. Only Sweden was more equal. That has changed completely. Tewkesbury may look like a chocolate box setting, but like any English town of this size, it is socially divided. It has its rich enclaves and its poor enclaves. The UK is the most economically unequal country in Europe, so perhaps it isn't surprising that it's the first country in the EU to choose to leave. All is not well here. The best off 10% of people in Britain take 28% of all income. Nowhere else in Europe did the best off 10% take so much, and half of that is taken by the best off 1%. Middle England is not a happy place. It is not a healthy place. It has been pulled apart by over 3 decades of growing inequality. When push became shove, a narrow majority across all of average England voted for the only apparent anti-establishment offer on the table.
So that film made by social geographer Danny Dorling. He's with us now, as is Damaris Kaufman, who's a senior lecturer in economics, or economic geography, is it, Damaris?
Essentially.
Yeah, at UCL. What did you think of what Danny was saying there?
Well, I very much agree with him that actually we need to get away from this idea that it's the northern working classes who are to blame, in inverted commas, for Brexit. I think that it is very much necessary to unpick this vote and to try to understand regional differences on the one hand, and also to ask whether or not it makes sense to ascribe this simply to the kind of Sunderland vote and the shock of that, and then to look for causes in the north. I think, though, that I'm a little bit concerned about two things. One is that it's not really clear what middle class means in England anymore. Everyone from your hairdresser to a hedge fund manager will tell you that they're middle class. And I think what he's suggesting is that this is a question of winners and losers, which is essentially a way of reframing class. And I'm wondering if that really gets us as far as we might think.
Come on, that is true, isn't it, Danny? What is middle class in the? We had A, B, C1, C2, D, E.
I've put A, B, and C1 together. C1 is junior professionals.
Yeah.
The key thing is that there's a large group of people, and the turnout was high. So they really did matter, and the majority
did leave whatever result was, because they're like more voters in that category. But look, let's just be clear, because the polling evidence. This is the YouGov last day of the thing. ABC 1, 57% remain, C2DE, 65% leave. I mean, you can see why the world has captured this narrative that working class, 2/3 basically for out, middle class, pretty comfortable majority.
Of those who voted, but the middle class is very large, the turnout is very large, and the key thing is that if a few more of the middle class had voted Remain, it would have been a Remain victory. The dog that didn't bark in the night was the lack of support in comfortable middle England for Remain, and that's crucial.
Yeah, I think there is an issue there, though, and that is that if you say that the middle class is very large, then there's a question of how well that plays with the equality argument. I think that the claim that austerity is responsible for Brexit, which is essentially what he's arguing, that it's the cut in public services, is certainly worth understanding. It's hit people very hard in the south. But on the other hand, in Scotland, where you have life expectancy that's falling much more rapidly, for instance, you got the opposite, where 2/3 of the electorate voted to remain,
much more
and saw European social democracy as the answer.
They had a different enemy, which was London. But the key thing is a very large number of people who are in A, B and C1 are not actually feeling that well off. Their children cannot start a family and get a house.
But maybe we're discovering A, B, C1, C2D is not the best way of slicing up the population and thinking about them. Maybe it's not north-south. How would you do it?
I do have actually a different explanation, and that is that I see it in terms, partly in terms of race and partly in terms of reactions to multiculturalism and reactions to modernity. So I think what is very revealing about the Ashcroft polls is that white Christians predominantly, or at least 53% of them, voted to leave. 47% of them voted to stay, but overwhelmingly 70% of Muslims, 2/3 of Asians, 80% of blacks voted to remain. So in a sense, people who are not white English saw their futures in the European Union. People who are white English saw their futures outside the European Union. And we see that very explicitly when Ashcroft's poll says people who consider themselves English, not British, 4 out of 5 of them wanted to get out. So I think we actually have something very similar to what's going on in the US right now with the Trump presidential candidacy, where you're seeing on the one hand a resurgence of white nationalism in a somewhat different
right. But sorry, is that class-based though? Because I can hear people saying, well, isn't that a white working class thing?
But I don't think it is. I think that the irony in the U.S. is that people tend to blame the Ku Klux Klan on the working classes, where elites are involved as well. And I think that actually, if you look at the sorts of attitudes that you're seeing in the constituencies where the most hard Brexit MPs are from, these are middle-class people who have fantasies of an Anglo-Saxon past, who see England is somehow unique and exceptional and different from Europe, and are subscribing to an idea of Englishness that is just as exclusionary as what we consider the soccer hooligans.
But they're also in areas that haven't done as well as London and so on. So they've been offered a continuation of reality for them, which doesn't look great, or voting for something which they're told will be better. And they voted for the alternative, which wasn't defined, but it was not a continuation of being the underdog, things being difficult, your schools not getting much better, your housing getting
change option, isn't it? So you're definitely going to vote for that if you.
But on the other hand, in terms of inequality, I live in Lambeth, which is one of the most unequal boroughs, but 80% voted to remain. And in London, you may be better off in some sense, but you see the inequality much more sharply.
Basically, I'm learning that it's really quite difficult to cut this up in any way. You can cut it up in lots of ways that make a bit of sense, but there's nothing that explains all of it. Yeah. Let me just ask you this. Danny, what do you think of the way politicians are now invoking their assumptions about public opinion to say what kind of Brexit we should have? The public voted for an end to the right of the European Court to tell us this or that or whatever. Is that making sense?
I don't think so, because we really still don't know. I mean, the interesting thing about this vote is how the money markets didn't predict it, how the spread betting didn't predict it. We cannot be sure exactly what the reason was for this. And so it becomes very easy to say the public have said this, the public have said that. But there is no solid reason. But what we can say is that there isn't a north-south divide. It is not a rich-poor divide. In a large amount of the south of England, a large amount of middle class, a lot of people voted to leave, and they were crucial to the result.
In all categories. Thanks both very much.